Greetings and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching Plan, Install, Configure, and Manage Client Access. It's a primary topic for the 70-341 Core Solutions Exchange 2013 certification exam. The subtopic we're discussing in this lesson is Plan, Deploy, and Manage a Client Access Server. Under the subtopic Plan, Deploy, and Manage a Client Access Server, this objective may include, but is not limited to, design to account for differences between legacy CAS and Exchange CAS or CAF, and configure Office Web Application. So in this one, it's just a limited set of objectives, but that's okay. So let's get started. From a scenario perspective, we're going to go with Go-Kart LLC called Gotta Go-Kart. It's a go-kart franchise in 10 different cities. Their problem is that most of their employees access email through mobile devices using ActiveSync connections or through a browser using Outlook web app. The goal is to review the various planning elements to the client access role, including the configuration of Office web applications. So let's talk a little bit about the deployment of the client access server role. First of all, you must deploy one client access server in every Active Directory site with mailbox servers. You also need to make sure that the CAS servers that are internet-facing are accessible using the chosen client protocol. So if users must access their mailboxes from the internet through the CAS, then the server must be accessible using, let's say, HTTPS, IMAP4, POP3, so you have to make sure that this is possible. And you can install the client access server on the same system as the mailbox server, on a separate system from mailbox servers, or even on multiple systems for redundancy and high availability. The client access server handles all client connectivity. However, unlike previous versions of CAS, whether it's CAS 2007 or 2010, it no longer does any data rendering. The client access server only provides authentication and proxy or redirection. The client access server role is comprised of three components: client protocols, SMTP for transport, and a call router. The CAS role is no longer as heavy and robust as it used to be. In fact, in Exchange 2013, it's called a thin protocol session stateless server. So unlike previous versions, session affinity is not required for the load balancing side to the client access server. And that's because the CAS server has been redesigned so that the logic now exists within the CAS to authenticate the request and then route the request to the mailbox server that hosts the active copy of that mailbox database. So at that point, there's no need for session affinity because the client access server is really just handling the proxy or redirection. So basically, the client access server, or as it was called in earlier versions of the release of Exchange 2013, the client access front end, or CAF, or CAFE if you look at it differently depending on how you spell it out, this is a protocol proxy. So clients connect, they're authenticated, and then client requests are proxied from the client access server to that mailbox server with the active mailbox database. And as was mentioned, the client access server doesn't do any data rendering. All of that is done on the mailbox server. So the connections to the client access server are considered stateless. There's never anything queued or stored on the client access server. So that's important to consider when you think of your mailbox servers at this point, because they're handling a bigger bulk of the workload than mailbox servers did with 2010 or 2007. And actually, the CAS server, which saw an increase in its workload from 2007 to 2010, is now seeing a decrease in its workload. In fact, we'll jump over in a moment and we'll take a look at the services running on a CAS server as opposed to a mailbox server so that you can see how much more the mailbox server is designed to do. Let's take a moment though, and let's jump over to a blog site from TechNet that talks a little bit more about the client access server role. I'd like for you to see what the architecture looks like under the hood. And so here we are on a blog post for the Exchange Team blog, with this article on Exchange 2013 Client Access Server Role. It was written by Ross Smith IV, and you really want to keep an eye out for anything that Ross writes, because he does a fantastic job of explaining the architectural pieces to Exchange, and he's actually the mind behind the mailbox calculator for determining the deployment of your mailbox servers. So certainly someone you want to keep your eye out for when it comes to Exchange. And so here we see an article that he wrote regarding some of the changes to Exchange 2013. And you can see here, if we just click the graphic, you can see how Exchange is designed now with the client access server to load balance, if you're using a load balancer, to load balance the different client types, so that when it comes to the CAS server, it doesn't really matter which CAS server is being connected to, so long as the protocols are available and communication can take place then between the CAS server and the mailbox server, so that the connection can be redirected or proxied over to the appropriate mailbox server database. Going back to Ross's blog post here, if we just scroll down some more, you can see that there is a tremendous amount of information here in this article with regard to the client access server role. And so this link again is mentioned in the additional research at the end of this lesson. If you really want to understand the inner depth and workings of the client access server role, you'll take a look at it. Let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk about the difference between legacy CAS and Exchange 2013 CAS. So let's talk for a moment about Legacy Client Access Server and E15 CAS or CAF, or in some cases CAFE, CAFE. So why is this an objective for the certification exam? Well, obviously they want you to understand the difference between Legacy CAS and what is new with Exchange 2013. However, when the objectives were written, there was a different term used for the CAS server in some internal documents. And so ultimately, the CAF or CAFE, it stands for Client Access Front End, which is what the client access role was called in Microsoft internal documents. Personally, I think they should have stuck with that, because it is a little bit confusing for those of us that worked with Legacy CAS, knowing what it did, to consider the Exchange 2013 CAS for what it really is. So it's really a redirector, it's a proxy, it's a service that runs, no data is being rendered on the CAS. So that's a lot of changes really for us that are coming from the legacy side. So it would have made sense to give it a whole new name. CAFE would have been just as good as any. So that is what that stands for. On the certification exam, you most likely will not see that expression or acronym or term. Nevertheless, because it still is part of the objectives, or at least it was part of the objectives when we created this course, it was essential that we explain what the term means. Otherwise, you'll go nuts trying to find the CAF role or what that acronym means, and it could take you a while. So ultimately, the CAS server role is a super smart proxy that no longer needs to maintain state or affinity. So if we look at that, if it's not keeping session data, it's not needing to maintain this affinity or state, well, what does all of this mean for us? Well, for one thing, much of the complexity for configuration of CAS has been removed. Now, that's not to say that there is nothing for us to do on the CAS server. No, there are still tasks, several key tasks that can be performed, including the management of digital certificates, that's primarily handled on the CAS server, and client protocol management for ActiveSync, POP3, IMAP4, all of this is handled on the CAS server, so there's still more to do there. In addition, load balancers that work at layer 4 of the OSI model, these can now be used, although layer 7 application-aware load balancers may be better in certain situations. So with the new Exchange 2013 CAS server, load balancing is completely different. Without the affinity requirement, load balancers can work at that lower level. Now, we say that layer 7 application-aware load balancers may be better, but really that depends on whether or not you need to apply greater intelligence in deciding how and when to distribute load between servers. So we keep saying that the CAS server is stateless and doesn't require affinity. What we mean by that is that previous versions of Exchange CAS required affinity. So for example, if someone was connecting in using Outlook web app, it required requests from a particular client be handled by a specific CAS server within a load balanced array of CAS servers. But that's different now. CAS 2013 is stateless. So because all processing for that mailbox happens on the mailbox server itself and the one that has the database, then it really doesn't matter which CAS server in an array of CAS servers takes the request and handles that request. So this change means that that session affinity is no longer needed at the load balancer level. So it allows us to purchase, really, to be frank, cheaper load balancers. And that's not to say that they're cheaper in terms of quality, it's just that they work at a lower level, and so they cost less because they don't provide the excessive level of intelligence that we might have needed in previous versions of Exchange. Another change with the CAS is that RPC for mailbox access, this is dead, it's done, it's over. So you still use RPC, but it's done over HTTP Secure or HTTPS. So there is no longer a need then for the RPC client access service, and it's no longer part of the equation, so that means that the CAS server doesn't have to perform those RPC client access requests. And it enables the use of things like HTTPS-based load balancing, so you don't need the separate namespaces or certificates that we needed with Exchange 2010. Now, as a result of the new services that are being run on the mailbox role, that role, the mailbox server role, becomes the bigger focus for performance design decisions. So that's something to keep in mind, that the CAS server has a job to perform, but much of the stress and strain is going to be put on the mailbox server role. Let's jump over and take a look at the client access server services, and then we'll look at a mailbox server, and you'll be able to see the difference in terms of the number of services that have to run on the mailbox server role with Exchange 2013 as opposed to the CAS server role. Alright, so here we are on the client access server, and you can see we have the services manager already opened. So we can take a look here and we can see under Microsoft Exchange we have the Active Directory topology, diagnostics, front-end transport, health manager, IMAP, monitoring, POP3, service host, and unified messaging call router. Now let's contrast this with the number of services on the mailbox server role. Alright, so here we are on a mailbox server, and if we take a look at the services, keep in mind this is a mailbox server that is not running with the CAS server. So we have them separated so that we can easily see the services that will only run on a CAS server or on a mailbox server. And here you can see the different services. There's quite a bit more to the mailbox server. So we have the anti-spam update, diagnostics, Edge Sync, health manager, and we continue down. You can see the RPC client access service, which is running on the mailbox server, not the client access server. You can see throttling, transport, unified messaging, so quite a bit more, again, running on the mailbox server as opposed to the client access server. Alright, let's jump back over to our slides and let's continue to discuss the benefits of the client access role. Alright, so let's discuss Exchange 2013 CAS benefits. For starters, as we already mentioned, RPC is no longer a supported direct access protocol. So all Outlook connectivity must be RPC over HTTPS or Outlook Anywhere. That's if it's going to be from Outlook. Obviously, if you're using a mobile device, you're using ActiveSync, or if you're going through a different type of solution, perhaps a different type of mail client as opposed to Outlook, you might be using POP or IMAP. So just in terms of RPC, if you're using Outlook, it has to be RPC over HTTPS. Now, upon first glance, that may seem like a limitation. Why would you want to use RPC over HTTPS or Outlook Anywhere when you have an Outlook client, when normally you use that internally and you use RPC with MAPI and you don't have a connectivity issue, it's different. Outlook Anywhere sometimes is tough to set up, so you might consider that as a mistake. but there are some benefits. The first of which is that you no longer need to have the RPC client access server running on the client access server. And we saw the services, so that service is no longer necessary. In addition, we need 2 fewer namespaces than what we needed when working with Site Resilient Solutions with 2010. And FQDN is not needed to connect because you go through Auto Discover and you use the user's mailbox GUID plus the @ symbol plus the domain, and a connection can be made. This is a new change where Outlook clients don't need to use FQDN, and the end result is that the end users will most likely not see that message, that horrible message that says your administrator has made a change to your mailbox, please restart. But it's good to keep in mind that the only Outlook clients supported with Exchange 2013 are Outlook 2007 and later. As far as CAS configuration, there are still a variety of different configuration tasks that you can perform. So although 2013 CAS doesn't handle processing for the client protocols, you can do things to the client access server. You can handle server certificates. You can use the certificate wizard to request a digital certificate, or you can use the Exchange Management Shell. And it's important to note that you don't need to install digital certificates on your mailbox servers for your organization. A self-signed certificate is installed by default on the mailbox servers, and that doesn't need to be replaced. The CAS server in the organization implicitly trusts that self-signed certificate on the mailbox server. So that's good to know. You only have to worry about certificates on your CAS servers. And you can also configure virtual directories. You can configure the virtual directories for the Offline Address Book, OAB, Exchange Web Services, Exchange ActiveSync, Outlook Web App, and the Exchange Admin Center. Let's jump over to our CAS server. We'll look at the Exchange Admin Center, and we'll take a look at what you can configure through the EAC in terms of virtual directories. Obviously, you can also go through the IIS management tools, but we'll just stick with the virtual directories options in the Exchange Admin Center. Alright, so we're back on the Client Access server, and we're looking at the Exchange Admin Center under the Servers feature. And you can see here that we have a couple of different options like virtual directories and certificates. If we click certificates to start, you can see that we can select the server, and in this case this is Mailbox 1, and you can see that this is the self-signed certificate that we were just talking about. If we select the down arrow, we can select another server, and then if we want to kick off the certificate wizard, we click the little plus sign over here. This will help us create a request for a certificate from a certification authority or create a self-signed certificate. And then once we have a certificate, we can finish off the wizard with that cert. We can also use the 3 little dots there to export an Exchange certificate and import it on another server. So there's quite a bit we can do that relates to the CAS server itself with regard to certificates. We again realize that the mailbox servers, they have self-signed certificates that we don't need to worry about. And then we have the Virtual Directories tab. And here we can see various virtual directories that we can access through the Internet Information Services or IIS managers. But if we look here, let's just take a look at one aspect of this. We see that we have Outlook Web App. Now, if we look under Permissions, we have Outlook Web App Policies. And if we open this up, we can see we have General, we have Features, we have File Access, and we see things like Direct File Access, Web-Ready Document Viewing, Force Web-Ready Document Viewing when a converter is available, and we'll talk about this in a moment as far as the 2013 way of handling Web-Ready Document Viewing. We see that's a public or shared computer. Under Private Computer, we have similar options. Now, if we go back to the virtual directories and we take a look at Outlook Web App, you'll note that the options are not necessarily the same. We have General, we have Authentication. So authentication is something that's not part of the Outlook Web App policy. It's part of the virtual directory itself. and we see that currently we're using forms-based authentication, whereas we could go back to standard authentication methods using integrated Windows authentication, digest authentication for Windows domain servers. So we have options here. Under features, we see the same features that we saw under the Outlook Web App policy, but we can configure it for the entire virtual directory as opposed to on a policy level. And then we have file access. And here again we see the same exact information. Direct file access, web-ready document viewing. It's good to note that the policy itself takes precedence over the virtual directory settings. Alright, so now let's jump back over to our slides and let's talk about the new Office Web App Server. Now, to be honest with you, the Office Web App Server being discussed as part of this lesson is a little bit odd. My belief is that it's connected because of the virtual directory side, and that's because through either Outlook Web App policies or through the virtual directory itself, you can configure web-ready document viewing. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, what does web-ready document viewing have to do with Office Web App Server? In fact, what is Office Web App Server? Okay, well, Exchange 2007 and 2010 allowed your Outlook Web App users to preview documents in emails from their browsers through the web-ready document viewing. Supported documents included Word, Excel, PowerPoint, PDFs. These were converted to HTML for display, and it wasn't great. It didn't show everything perfectly, but you did have the ability to open those documents in preview if you didn't have the application installed, or even if you did have the application installed. So you could take that document and download it, or you can preview it with the web-ready document viewing, or you could even force the web-ready document viewing for end users to utilize. However, Exchange 2013 uses a better method through the use of an Office Web Apps server. However, whereas with Exchange 2013 it was included within Exchange, it was built right in, now you need to install this extra server piece. And it's good to note that it's not just for Exchange 2013, but SharePoint 2013 and Lync 2013 use this Office Web Apps server as well. So what happens is a Web App Open Platform Interface, or WAPI, call is made to the Office Web Apps server, which then will render the document. And it actually does a better job than what we had with 2007 and 2010. Now, in terms of setting this up and working through this, this is actually what I would like to call a boutique lesson. It's something that really could be its own lesson, standing on its own, configuring and setting up the Office Web App server. So instead, what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at an msexchange.org blog post where the process was mapped out perfectly for us. We can take a look at the process, and at the end of the lesson, there is an additional research link to that document, as well as to a TechNet article that links you off to how you would configure and set up the Office Web Apps server. No doubt at some point in the future, we will create this special Office Web Apps server boutique lesson. But for now, let's just make sure you know what this is, how it works, and how it's configured so that you can pass that certification exam. Alright, so here we are on msexchange.org, and you can see the article we're looking at is Exchange 2013 with Office Web App Server integration. And so the link for this is provided at the end of this lesson in the additional research section. Now you can see here, when using Exchange 2007 or 2010, Outlook Web App users were able to preview documents. And so you would get a document preview notification here, and then when you opened it up, if you took the preview, notice here open as a web page, if you took the preview, it would show you how that document would look through an HTML page. And you can see it's not necessarily perfect, but it was better than nothing. So if you were working with a system that did not have Office installed, you could still read the documents because the Exchange server actually provided the ability to open these and preview them. Now with 2013, you can see that we have to go through the process of installing an Office Web App server. And so here you can see that you can run the Add Windows feature, You have to add in all of these different features to install it first, and then the screenshots just show us that installing this is not a big deal. We accept the license, we choose a file location, we say close, and we're good to go. Now, as far as configuration of Office Web App Server, you'll notice that there's no GUI to manage it. Everything is done through the PowerShell commandlets that you see here. And so, as we look further, configuring Office Web App Server, obviously it's important to configure it properly. As you can see, part of the process of working with the Office Web App Server is you have to create a farm, even though you might install it on a single server. And so there's configuration involved using the new-Office Web Apps farm commandlet. There is certificate information that has to be configured as well, and then you can test to see if it's working properly. Now, once that's done, you now need to configure the server integration so that you can configure it to work with Exchange 2013. And so that's where you set the -organization config properties here. This is done from the Exchange Management Shell. And then, of course, it continues to go down the line to see if everything worked out properly, to see if the app server is rendering. Ultimately, the final test will be when you take a document and open it up. And you can see here from the screenshot that Office Web App Server is, as it says here, much more faithful to the actual document than with web-ready document viewing. So you remember we looked at this same document up above, and it was okay, but not as good as what we see here. So it's good to note again that this is the way forward when it comes to viewing documents, previewing them from within Outlook Web App. Obviously, if you have Office installed, you can always download the document and open it right off of your system. But having the ability to look at it, having it look as faithful to the original document as possible, all of this is really nice, and with Office Web App Server we have the ability to accomplish that. It will take some configuration on our part as the administrator, but ultimately when it's done, the end users will appreciate the enhancements. Alright, so let's jump back over to our slides and let's close out our scenario and provide some additional research links. Alright, so jumping back to the scenario, got a go-kart. We've discussed planning elements, and it seems wise to establish multiple CAS servers and use a load balancer. We're going to recommend in this case a Kemp load balancer. Now, an Office Web App Server will be configured and set up for them, and they'll use this over the built-in document viewing that they had with previous versions of Exchange 2010 and 2007. Some additional research you might want to take a look at includes the Exchange 2013 Client Access Server role. That's a blog post by Ross Smith IV that we took a look at earlier. The Deploy Office Web App Server TechNet article is another one. And then we have the Exchange 2013 with Office Web App Server integration. That's the msexchange.org article that we walked through. Certainly all of it good information for you to get a better handle on deploying your Client Access Server role. So we hope you found this informative. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.